Hello and welcome to our, believe it's the 41st SLiTHER. These are group discussions focused around professional development for chemistry teachers through the Ionic Viper community. So these are recorded, and this will be posted as an LO on the Ionic Viper website. And so today we're delighted that Rebecca Jones is coming to talk a little bit about something that I really want to learn a lot about and do more of in my classes, which is peer review in chemistry classes. And so we'll have a presentation from Dr. Jones, and then after that, we'll have a discussion. So take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Kyle. And thanks for those of you that were able to join us this afternoon. We're going to tell you all a little bit about why we should do peer review, tell you some of my experience with it, and then tell you some about how I think I'm going to use it in the future. Excuse me. So why peer review? Okay, so well, here's a few. Here's a few things that that I've thought of as why peer review in our classes is a good thing. And the first thing is that science was built on peer review, and we know this from our own experiences. But sometimes our students don't get this. Sometimes they don't get it at all until they do research with us. And then they really see that, oh, there is this collaborative process that and kind of the accountability of fellow scientists that goes into this to how science gets published and how science gets really done. And I've been thinking about peer review as a way that we can actually model what is really happening in science, and we can bring it in a constructive way into our classrooms. So because science itself was really built on peer review and on the accountability of scientists, we can do it in our classes also. Sometimes students aren't really successful on something the first time they try it. And this is maybe not even the second or the third time. But I think peer review can be really useful because they can learn not only from the professor, but also from each other. And it kind of lowers the barrier that failure sometimes feels like, right? They want to do really, most of the time students want to do well, but it's difficult when assignments are hard or things are really unfamiliar, maybe like writing a new style of lab report, for example. Another reason to do peer review is that learning to collaborate and communicate are really valuable outcomes. And I think doing peer review actually challenges students to collaborate in different ways and to communicate in different ways in a much more kind of horizontal way as opposed to vertical, like up to the professor. And I think that those skills are going to be super important for 21st century problem solvers, because that's the way big problems in the future are going to get solved. So the better and the more we can teach our students to collaborate and communicate with each other about scientific ideas, especially, the better. Now, I also wanted to give you all some literature examples about why peer review. And so one of the first ones that I've already alluded to when I mentioned lab reports, but writing is definitely a place where peer review can make a difference, and it can improve student lab report writing. This paper from 2016 talks about how it's mimicking the scientific process where we submit papers to journals, we get feedback from peers, we rewrite, we resubmit, and until we've reached some point where hopefully things are accepted. And peer review in a classroom setting can mimic that and help improve lab reports to be of higher quality and really better science overall. Peer review can also help with conceptual understanding. And this paper in 2013 also talks about how it improves motivation and can help developing critical thinking skills. Also, outcomes that we would hope to have in almost all of our classes, and to know that peer review itself can actually help reach some of these goals is another reason to invest time practicing learning how to do it. This article from 2016 talks about using peer review in a chemical literature course, and specifically it looks at how that peer review helps improve the information literacy outcomes. This is another area where we say we really care about students learning and being scientifically literate by the time they graduate from our programs, but this is definitely a difficult thing to do. And peer review is one place where we can maybe help move that needle a little bit and help bring them closer to scientific literacy. A couple more examples, interactions that happen in peer review. I alluded to in my earlier notes there that peer review encourages collaboration and collaborative learning as well as interaction. And this paper that was just recently published actually looked at infographics, which is something I'm going to share with you about from my experience too. And then another final reason is that peer review can provide helpful feedback to students from somebody besides the instructor. And this has a lot of different benefits, but one of them is definitely that it takes some of the burden off the instructor themselves when it comes to being the only source of feedback for student work. When peer review is incorporated, you get additional perspectives on the work that people, that your students are doing. And that can be really helpful to make all of the work better. So let me share with you some of my experience with peer review. The first time I started doing peer review was actually when at my first faculty position at Austin Peay State University. And it was in a first semester inorganic class where the students were not super familiar with writing lab reports. They didn't really have anything, any frame of reference besides the cookbook kind of fill in the table to answer the question kind of report. In this class, I wanted, because it was a junior level course, I wanted it to have more writing. And so I gave them more structure in the reports, and I started out with a template. And so this was a template that I actually modeled after a template that my graduate advisor developed for a lab class I helped teach with him in grad school. I modified it for this new course, or this course that I was teaching at Austin Peay, and gave them this template and instructions. And along with having a template and having more structure to the report was a peer review sheet that they would submit with the final report. So they would write up their lab report in this style of a JAX communication, and then they would submit the report to each other, and they would submit along with this rubric. They would use this rubric essentially to evaluate one of their peers' reports, and then they would submit both the report to me as well as this peer review. And all that would get turned in. And then I would use the same rubric to actually evaluate the final report. This process was probably less structured than it could have been. When I did it, I allowed people to use kind of any outside person. It didn't have to be a peer in the class. And that actually led to some challenges because the other people, like the other students, maybe a biology major or something that they would have read the report wouldn't understand it quite as in the same way. So I think if I were to do this again, I would definitely structure that peer review step a little bit more. But it was really helpful, and the reports absolutely got better. And the first round, that before I did the peer review part, the reports were abysmal. And then after I gave them some framework about what to expect, they got much, much better. And so that was, I feel, a really positive way of seeing how the lab report writing could get better, as well as helping those students learn from each other. It also meant that by the time I graded it, I wasn't the first person that has also looked at it besides the person that wrote it. There was somebody else who had already looked at it and given them some feedback. The second example I'm going to share with you all is about the infographic projects that I incorporate into my undergraduate classes here at Mason. And these are semester-long creative research projects that I incorporate into both my general and inorganic chemistry courses. And there have been different topics that I've used depending upon the course or kind of what I'm interested in. The chemistry, general chemistry for engineers, I've done elements in engineering. We've also, in general chemistry, I've done Once Upon a Chemist, where we profile different chemists. We did a special one for the periodic table anniversary that happened in 2019. And then in my bioinorganic classes, which is a senior level course, we've done bioinorganic chemists as well as bioinorganic topics. And we use the Blackboard portal to facilitate the peer review of this. So, and I'll show you all a timeline for these projects in a little bit, but the peer review, essentially it's the self and peer assessment in Blackboard. And so this portal can be a little uncomfortable the first time you try to set it up. But once you figure out kind of how it needs to look, it's not too difficult. And this is actually a screenshot of one of the ones from this semester. So by August 23rd, my students turned in their first draft, and you can see that submission date is the window that submission portal was open. And then for the next 3 weeks after that was when the evaluation window is open. So that's actually going on now. And that evaluation kind of looks like this over on the left. When the students come back to the assignment, it has 3 of their peers down at the bottom, and they would click on like user 1, and it would open up that peer's submission. They would view it, and then I do give them some instructions and criteria on how to evaluate that peer's work. So I asked them to rank the work on a scale of 1 to 10. How effective is that information graphic? And to answer some questions in the written feedback section at the bottom, and then to consider some elements that are maybe not very familiar to a lot of science students, but things that are really familiar to graphic design, like focus, content, composition, and conventions. And this for a long time is the only criteria that I gave, and I kind of just would see kind of what would happen. What I've gotten to now is that I have actually provided a more detailed rubric with expectations about these different components. And the students get this rubric in advance, and then they're asked to actually evaluate each other using the rubric. And this portion of the assignment happens in the middle of the semester, which having it at this point in the semester forces them to not wait to actually do the assignment as opposed to waiting until the end of the semester. So having a first draft has been super helpful. And then having the peer review be an integrated part of the assignment, the students have consistently said that's one thing they liked about it. They felt like it was really great to hear what their peers thought and to get that feedback. Another form of peer review that we do connected to the infographic projects is at the end, and that is the gallery walks. And so the last day of these classes, and here's some examples from 4 and 5 years ago, where you can see the infographics are hanging on the whiteboards or on the walls of the room. And you can see the little post-it notes underneath the graphics. And this is another peer review opportunity. Essentially, every student on that last day brings in a printed copy of their graphic, and then I give them 5 post-it notes each, and I say you need to walk around and read the graphics, or read a bunch of them, and then provide some feedback for at least 5 of the graphics. And if you wanted to do more, I always encourage them to do more if they have time. One of the semesters that we did this was a semester that celebrated the anniversary of the periodic table in 2019. And so our infographics that semester were the periodic table, and we actually built it and hung it up on a wall in our building in Exploratory Hall. And here's another image of the entire table. And the students were so excited about the opportunity to make a periodic table that was kind of like larger than life, that we ended up making a human periodic table. And so here you can see they're holding up their main group elements, and we didn't have 118 people in the class, so I didn't have enough to do everybody, but we were able to at least get the main group elements as a human periodic table. And then some other examples of the gallery walks from more recent semesters. I've kind of kept with the similar tradition. I have had students do some additional comments and complete like a reflection at the end, which one of these days that will be something to write up. You can see the classrooms have changed a little bit. This is now in our new building, but the process of doing this gallery walk peer review is one that I've continued, and students always enjoy this at the end of the semester. And it's a lot of fun for me too, to see all their graphics up at once. It's a great time also where they get to really learn about a lot of other science that maybe we didn't even talk about in the class, which I think is also really fun. And it's definitely a project I enjoy doing every semester and look forward to every semester. So just to summarize where that peer review evaluation window is, and this is the whole timeline for that semester-long project. And I love this really colorful graph or figure. Start looking for the start of semester to the end. And the peer review window is really kind of right in the middle of the semester. And essentially that's when I usually try to do it after the first exam has been handed back, but before they take the second exam. So usually there's kind of a lull where there's not quite as much stressful stuff happening, at least in my class, when I can make that first draft due. And that's often when I pick that date. And it's worked out pretty well. They don't seem to be too upset about it's not the same week as an exam or of something like that, which would make it extra stressful. So those are two examples of more formal peer review that I've done. I also wanted to, as I was reflecting on this for this talk today, also thinking about more informal peer review. And I wanted to share with you all some about recent changes I've made to my courses in fall of 2020, just in response to being online. I shifted all my classes to a flipped format. So they watch lectures at the beginning of the week, and then when they come to class, we do in-class group problem solving. And you could see in some of those pictures from the gallery walks, the large whiteboards. We also have smaller whiteboards in some of the rooms. And it is actually very, very regular that I see students pointing at something that another student has written and trying to understand it or trying to figure it out. And in reality, that is an example of peer review too, right? It's collaboration, it's group problem solving, it's discussion, and it's two people trying to understand something and work on it together. In my inorganic class, I regularly do questions like what is familiar or what was new, like thinking about the videos. And we do lots of different problem solving things together. And again, I very often have 2 or 3 people standing at the board, and they'll be like arguing about something, or they'll be trying to figure it out, and then they'll ask me, and it's actually an incredible example of how they're wrestling with the concepts and trying to learn the new ideas. And so I see that, and I mean, we would say we could put that in the active learning bucket if we wanted to, but we also could say it's got some elements of peer review as well. So some final thoughts before we shift to some discussion. Peer review, I really see it as shifting the focus. When we do it in our classes, we're stepping away from the mode of the sage on the stage and moving more into problem solving and collaboration. And students can learn from each other and actually really value each other's insights. And I think that's an important outcome that peer review enables us to reach. Peer review can also meet with resistance, and I haven't touched on this too much, but we certainly can talk about it in our discussion time today. Sometimes it can be perceived as less valuable, and I have noticed in the years that I've done it, especially for the infographic project, that it's often difficult for students to really give honest, critical feedback to each other. A lot of times they don't want to do that. Even when I tell them it's not something that is going to be affecting their grade, it is something they still struggle with doing. So I think it's always really good to partner peer review with faculty review if you can, and if it's reasonable. And that's just because it can help. It also can be inconsistent. And this is another thing that it's difficult to teach people to do peer review. And we all know from reading reviews of articles that we have, right? Like reviewer number 3 never likes the paper, like no matter what, right? So the peer reviews are like by nature inconsistent, or they can be. And we see that in student peer review also. All right. And I think that's actually okay. That's not necessarily a defect, but it's definitely an artifact of doing this that we should acknowledge and kind of recognize. And the last point is that peer review builds confidence and it can reveal strengths. And when we do these gallery walks at the end of the semester, I have seen students that are quiet the whole semester and hardly talk to me. And when they come in, they bring in this amazing, incredibly powerful infographic, and I had no idea they had such incredible talents. But those gallery walks and then the reviews that happen, like when they're at home, they're not actually in person, are really less stressful than a presentation. And those students who have creative talents can really shine in those moments. And so it's been wonderful to really see that some students who have those gifts and strengths, they can see like this infographic project, for example, as a place where they can share that. And the peer review and the positive feedback they get from their peers is definitely a confidence booster. I've also told students sometimes one of the outcomes that comes out of those infographic projects is that they realize how hard it is to do really good information graphics. And then they learn to value that more in others. And I think that's a really good outcome also, because that's not something that we can always teach, but it's definitely something that this project in particular helps us see. And the peer review is an important part of that. Okay, so future plans. Every spring semester, I lead and I organize an undergraduate research colloquium for the College of Science. And this is a judged event, and we have posters, and we've had oral presentations in some years. And during the pandemic, this entirely changed, as you might imagine. But I've really been trying to think about how we can engage the students even more with each other's research and have it not just be, I make a poster and I go stand by my poster and maybe a judge or two comes and talks to me. But if we incorporated a peer review component into this, it would be a whole lot closer to like what a scientific conference would be, or what actually just, I think incorporating peer review would just make it a better event for the students and maybe have some new outcomes that could come from it that we haven't before. So I'm thinking about how we might incorporate those things. The other class that I'm working on is a new cooking with chemistry class that's coming up in the spring. And this actually should say chemistry in the kitchen. I just realized I don't have the right name for the class. That's how new it is. Like I literally just designed it this year and I'm going to be teaching it in January. But I'm definitely going to incorporate that course is going to have a major research component in it. It's also going to have presentations and written work. And there's going to be a lot of different avenues of peer review. There'll be some things that are informal and some things that are more formalized and that are offline. And I'm definitely going to incorporate a lot of communication among the class. and incorporate a lot of peer review in there to have that'll just be a formalized portion of the course, is that they're giving each other feedback on what they're working on. All right, and with that, thank you very much for your attention. And I'd love to take questions or talk more about these ideas with you all.
All right, thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, so now we're going to go into the open discussion part of the SLiTHEr. So like I kind of mentioned earlier, I am someone who is really curious about this and wants to do more. And so one thing you'd mentioned that I was just curious about, you said that the Blackboard has like a peer eval
Yep.
built in already.
Well,
Or can you turn it on or something like that, right?
so there's there's like, I don't know how many different versions of Blackboard there are.
Yeah.
There's too many, right?
Yeah.
So, but we do have the version that Mason has, it's under course tools, and it's called self and peer assessment. And the first time I looked at it, I was like, what is that? Like the whole first time I used it, I made so many mistakes. So because it was really kind of clunky. But it actually works. It works great. Mm-hmm. And it essentially, the students go to this one place and they submit their work, and then the algorithm actually like reshuffles them. You can set it so that it's always anonymous, which is great. And then you control all of the parameters, like when they can do the submission window, when they do the evaluation window. And then at the end of it, you actually can release the scores to the gradebook. And now this is the part that's kind of tricky, is like, I want them to be honest in their reviews. And so I basically tell them, don't worry, if somebody did a really not a good job, you should give them a 1, right? Like, you should tell them this needs to be better. But I grade them, I tell them, and I have to do this manually, like after the fact. This is the part that's extra hard, is I tell them, I'm grading you on, did you do it? Not what did you get from your peers? So I go back into the assignment, and you can download the results and actually see who did it. And then I have to go in and make sure that they all get the full credit for having done it. And the ones that didn't do it, they're the ones that don't get credit for that part of the assignment. And the whole assignment's worth, like, actually over the whole semester, it's worth the same as a midterm, or maybe it's a little less than a midterm now. I think it's 100 points. So it's about 10% or so of the grade for the whole semester. And like doing the peer review part is like 10 points or something. Yeah. So maybe 1% of the whole class, but should be relatively easy points, right? You just have to do the thing I'm asking you to do. So
yeah, because that's one of the issues I've always had is like going to a more like asynchronous forms, like how to get the students to do it. And then the fact that Blackboard has something like that, it's awesome. I don't think we use D2L. I don't think it has something. I'll ask my folks.
Yeah, it might be one of those things where it's buried.
Yeah, and has to be turned on, or something has to be turned on. Yeah. Cool.
But I bet, because I know that a lot of like the humanities and social sciences, they absolutely use peer review a whole lot more than the sciences do. And there has to be some like structured way to do that in those courses, right? So it's probably there. It's just, like you said, it's probably not maybe turned on. Like maybe there's a button somebody in IT has to click, and then it'll work.
Yeah. Cool. Before I hog anymore, does anybody else have questions or things they want to chat about with peer review?
Just an idea, and I don't know if this could be something you've already tried before. I personally haven't tried this, so so this is just off the cuff.
Sure, that's cool.
But I found with other assignments where I wanted to see improvement in my students' products, having a sample was a good idea. So maybe consider taking writing or making an infographic yourself that has key things that you like them to think about and discuss, and then having them do that in class maybe before it opens up, so that they understand like the types of comments that you think are appropriate, but also would be helpful for their peers to get. So then when it does come for acknowledging maybe some area that needs improvement, they have those kind of tools and words to use to provide that feedback.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I do give them examples, but it's at the beginning of the semester when they're like trying to pick a topic. But I think like an example of how to do a review would probably be really, really good idea.
Yeah. I think that's a challenge I've had too. It's like
Yeah.
when I've done this, and it's usually in person, but then like, I look at the final results and it's like, yeah, it's clear that they need some more guidance as to how to do a review. And they're like, oh yeah, it's good. Like, no, you need more info. Like, and so I really like that rubric that you had, and it was nice that you used the same rubric for the peer review as the assessment. So they knew that, like, this is the same. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this semester, that is how I did it with those lab reports, and that helped a huge amount on those lab reports. That was a giant improvement. And this is really the first semester that I've been going to be using the rubrics on the assignments themselves and the drafts. And so we'll see if that helps. I hope, if anything, it provides a little more clarity, like, because I mean, a good rubric, right, should tell students what they do well and what they're not doing well, so that they know. And I think that's where there's been some gray areas, even though I always would write written comments, but I think they would still struggle with that. And it also, I mean, I have 77 in one class and 25 in the other. So the rubric should make my life a little easier, I hope, on the assessment side. We'll see. That's on my list to do this weekend.
Great.
Yeah, hi. I had a question.
Yeah.
I had a couple, but I'll start with one.
Okay.
About the assessment or the rubrics that you're using, for those, have you found that it's better with students to have it be very quantitative, where they're ranking kind of 1 through 5, versus providing general or broad comments, or maybe specific comments, but more qualitative, and that if there's an interplay between that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can definitely, let me go back to that. Look back at those rubrics from, it's been forever. And yeah, I've mostly stick with the qualitative ones. I was looking even back at that lab report rubric that I developed many moons ago. But the ones that I'm using this semester, they're actually based on the AAC&U value rubrics for I think they were oral communication, but then we modified them for, they have an oral communication rubric and a written communication rubric, and I think I kind of merged them in some ways to come up with something that would work. And I'm happy to share those if you're interested. I think the qualitative things are, I don't know, and I think my engineering students probably would prefer it to be numerical, and I think it's way harder for them to think qualitatively about it. But I think that's part of the squishy part of what this can be, right? And I don't necessarily want them to be able to, I mean, when they do the peer review through that portal, they do have to assign a number ultimately, but I also make them answer some questions. Like, I make them think about it and try to communicate about it. So it's not only, oh, that's a 10. Well, why is it a 10? Right? So like, I think that is part of the learning that I want them to be doing. And I think having the rubrics themselves be on the qualitative side of the spectrum really forces that. It also makes it so that I can use that same rubric to judge the 80-point final product as well as the 20-point first draft, right? So it makes it a little simpler to not have a point value on it. Now, when I put the rubrics into Blackboard and I'm actually using them, I had to tell what percentage is which. So I had to do that. But again, I'm not sure how that will work, but I think that's a great question. And I think there's room for some experimentation about what your class would be comfortable with. I also think it's good to sometimes push them to be on the uncomfortable side when it comes to this, at least a little bit. This is a safe place to practice being uncomfortable when it comes to those things. because there's lots of squishy places in real life that they're going to run into that they have to navigate. And so if they can practice that in this space, then they're going to be better off in the future. So
yeah, no, thanks. And I'm thinking a lot right now about kind of the junior level inorganic class and things that I'm teaching. And it's one of their first times they're writing a full lab report. And
yeah,
it's one of those where when we get to an introduction, there's a lot of things that could be a B. There's a lot of different ways to write that introduction.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, and then I guess one of the things that we run into a little bit that's been popping around my head too is perhaps on the philosophical side, but it's like, where does potential academic honesty or dishonesty come in with a lot, especially if you're going into results and discussion section where you're kind of asking for specific questions, like by peer reviewing, are they getting an answer in an incorrect way? I mean, I don't know if anyone has thoughts on.
I've kind of had that issue from a different angle, which is if they're all writing the same lab report, right? And they're just peer reviewing it, do they have like a set, like it should be this for all of them, right? And so I really like that Rebecca has their students doing different, they're peer reviewing a different element in their O's in the infographics, right? And that I think is really valuable. And so I'm almost, if I want to implement peer review, I'm almost thinking of making it somehow such that the students aren't all reviewing the same lab somehow, right? Like, I don't know how I'm going to do that, but yeah. Anyways.
Well, I feel like I almost answered my own question there in a way too, where I just said the introduction could look like 10 different things versus the results and discussion that might all look the same. Okay, if the introductions are the thing that are struggling, then maybe that's where.
And there were actually at least some of the semesters that I used that rubric, we actually would do just, and actually I think the first time we did it, we would just peer review like the results and the discussion, and that would be it. And so we didn't do the whole report. We would just exchange those, right? And then another one, we would just exchange the introductions. Another one, we would just, exchange experimental methods and results. And there's so much value. The more they read, just like we learned so much from reading papers in our field, right? I mean, we learned so much about those cultural norms, about how our science is communicated. We learned that by reading primary literature, right? I mean, that's how we learned it. But they can learn so much of that by reading each other, right? And especially if you can show them, or, I'm going to say one set of experiments I used to do, I actually gave them a literature article and we did the experiment based upon that article, but then they had to still write the experimental method and they couldn't copy the article. They had to write their own experimental methods. So they had to find their own voice, right? And I think that's another part that the peer review process essentially it says, I value that part about how you're speaking about your science, and it honors that voice that each student has, and it helps them figure out what that voice, like what are the norms for the field that you're writing for, which, I mean, talk about hidden curriculum, right? I mean, that's totally hidden curriculum. Like, they don't put that stuff in the books anywhere. You only learn it from having a mentor that teaches it to you, right? But I think peer review is a place where we could start that conversation and we can help bring them into that reality of what it means to be a scientist. And that's, whether or not they get all the way there, like even if they just get part of the way there, it's a win, right? They may not get all the way there until they're actually writing a paper with a grad student and a postdoc and a faculty mentor, right? At some point in the future, like then they might be there, but you're going to help them get there quicker by doing this earlier. I would love to see peer reviews happening in Gen Chem. I don't know if anybody's doing that, but man, I would love to see that, because I've actually thought about, I have some like short essay questions. Some of my students hate this when I put essay questions on my Gen Chem exams, but like describe physical and chemical properties and give examples in your own words, describe the difference between physical and chemical properties, right? And give examples of each. I would love to have them do that, bring in an answer, and then peer review each other's answer.
Yeah.
Like that's where I was getting at the end, how I think some of the stuff that we do or we could do in an active learning classroom, it really is like peer review. I mean, it's not the traditional send it in and get somebody to write it, but it could be, in some ways, it really is peer review, and it's learning from each other and it's benefiting from different perspectives and all of the above. So definitely more informal, but hi, Matthew, welcome.
Hello. So Rebecca, I actually used to do that in my lab. So I would devote an entire lab class to, here is what your peers have written. 4 lab reports or 4 sections, and I'd give them typically a good example, a bad example, and a mediocre example. And it was amazing the conversations they would have. Oh, this one's too wordy. Oh, this one's too detailed. Oh, this one is so great because it's ambiguous. It's like, really? Okay. It was a really interesting way to gauge, I don't know, student understanding of scientific writing.
Yeah.
So I would give them a bunch of anonymized peer review or peer writing samples after I had asked the students if I could use them. And then I had a worksheet that they were supposed to work through separately. And then they would discuss their answers on the worksheet throughout the entire class. And students would always come back and say, I wish we did this the first day. And I always would say, yeah, you need a little practice first. You need to have a little fun with it first. So I started that in Gen Chem 2, but I moved it to both Gen Chem 1 and then repeated it in Gen Chem 2 just to say, hey, this is how we started out. Let's review again. We've taken a break. Everybody forgot what we did last semester. Let's start doing that again. It's good. It helps them, I think.
You should post that as an LO, man.
Yeah, I probably should.
Yeah,
I've got good data on it. At least I've got good anecdotal data. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's okay. That's enough for an LO.
Yep.
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 That's true.
No data is enough for an LO. It's fine. All right. Any other thoughts or discussion?
I had one more I was wondering about with the specific to more of the reports. Was there any from the peer review I guess I'm wondering what the effect was in terms of, was there any sections that were significantly improved over potentially not doing peer review?
Good question.
That would be a good chem ed research project.
Yeah, I think from what I remember, the sections that were experimental methods and results were usually those were pretty solid, kind of from other labs they'd had to do that writing. They were kind of used to that. The difference was in the discussions and in the introduction. Those definitely got better. And I would say the introduction absolutely got better. And then, the other thing that got better that I think is definitely something I don't think we teach enough, but the abstracts got better. And abstracts are super hard, when students have forgotten this probably by this point too, right? But abstracts are hard to write. But they definitely got better once they also, I think there was also, I definitely talked about this when we were doing these reports, but that you don't actually write papers from the beginning to the end. Nobody writes that way, even though that's the way we read them. That's not the way we write them. Again, that's another secret. Nobody tells you that secret. But when nobody writes them that way, the paper I'm writing right now, I just finished writing the results and now I'm ready to start the discussion, but I am actually not even sure what the introduction is going to look like yet, because I'm not 100% sure what I even want to say. So how do I introduce it, right? So I think helping them understand kind of the orders that we actually process what we're doing in lab and communicate it was part of it. And I think definitely those parts that are more narrative heavy, those are the ones that got better. And those are the areas I think where students struggle the most. It is where you can see some kind of academic misconduct potentially. But I think if if we go into the scenario or we go into the setting where we're wanting people to find their own voice and saying that everybody has a unique way of talking about these things, and that's what your introduction should be, and right, that's what your discussion should be. If we say that, I mean, they're going to be less inclined to try to just copy each other's. Also, you're the one reading it, right? I mean, they're not going to, hopefully they don't think you're stupid enough to not catch it, right? I mean, sometimes I think they do, but.
All right.
If I can, I'll add really quickly that peer review lab that I used to do was really good for abstracts. It really
I
gave
bet.
everybody a chance to see, I would give them examples, but it allowed them to see how people were writing abstracts and what constituted a well put together abstract. And also in figures and tables and things like that. Data presentation. It offered a really good way. Sorry, I didn't mean to hijack it with that.
No, that's all. Yeah, definitely tables that's another thing that's, unless somebody shows you how to do it, it's hard, right? Or it is hard even when you know how to do it. Sometimes you have this like data and you're like, how do I even communicate this? Like, then you have to try to figure it out, right? It's like the puzzles of our lives sometimes. So yeah, that's a great example.
So I put a survey in the chat because this, as we're getting to the end here, if you want to continue the discussion too, our Discord server is a great place to continue the discussion on peer review, and I look forward to hearing more about it. But also the survey is for seeing if you got what you got out of this, and also any ideas you might have for other things we could discuss in these kind of Zoom format like this, for things, and we've covered all sorts of topics with SLiTHERs. There's like 40 something now, and you can go see the topics on Viper, but any ideas you would have for having these types of conversations would be great.
And Kyle's not trying to boot you out. That's why I'm here, is to take over for him in case he needs to go. So he's not putting a fork in the conversation.
No. So, but yeah, thanks again for
thank you for having me
doing this. And please, again, everybody fill out the survey, and I'll stop recording.